Okay, so now that we've talked about how planet Earth was actually formed, now we're going to go in to talk about the life that was in there and the stages that we gone through in our history on life and kind of the procession of that. And so we're going to talk about the geologic time scale. And so we're going to start with the late Precambrian time period. So here's what we know about the late Precambrian time period. And again, this is a lot of hypotheses. Nobody was there. So we don't have recorded history from that time period, and we don't have as many fossils as we'd like. We do know, however, that nearly 80% of Earth's history has passed before the multicellular life has evolved, which means during this time period we have a lot of prokaryotes. We don't have a lot of eukaryotic organisms. About 2 billion to a half billion years ago, the Earth was experiencing a lot of changes in what we call climate change. We still had a supercontinent known as Pangaea just forming. It wasn't here yet. We have a lot of volcanic activity, eruptions. We have massive storms that would make Hurricane Katrina look like just a little tidal wave. So Earth at this time is not a really hospitable place. It's pretty violent still. Our atmosphere has extreme levels of carbon dioxide in it. We are just seeing the first photosynthetic organisms start to arrive during this time period. Most of the organisms we have were reproducing asexually, but by the end of this, we have evolved a new adaptation called sexual reproduction. So at the end of the late Precambrian period, we have this huge advancement of sexual reproduction, which is amazing, which allowed for a lot more diversity. But let's talk about the climate a little bit. So we know that it had a greenhouse effect because of the high levels of CO2, and so our planet was really hot. And so we're kind of seeing that now. On planet Earth, more CO2 levels, we're seeing an increase in our planet's temperature. And we also know that this happened, and then we had an extreme cooling, and so we went into an ice age, which we are projected to go into sooner than expected. This is just a regular cycle for the Earth. Every time we see a greenhouse or an overall warming of our planet, we see then a massive ice age. The cool prediction about this portion of life's history is that we had a huge snowball. So the picture that you actually see on the PowerPoint is what they call snowball Earth. And this is where Earth actually cooled to the point where it looked like, instead of the blue oceans, everything was frozen. We looked like a white snowball. This was one of the longest ice ages. It was super cold, and we had snow covering the entire planet. So dramatic climate change during the late Precambrian time. With any ice age, we have a complete mass extinction, which happened at the end of this. But anyway, let's talk about new adaptations. We started that a little bit earlier. So sexual reproduction was one of the huge adaptations during this time period. It allowed for genetic diversity, huger gene pools, and so we saw that the survival rate of organisms started to increase because of this. We also started seeing prokaryotes live in colonies. And so like when we did our experiment where we actually collected bacteria and you could see the little colonies forming, these were actually bacteria living together, and then they started having specialized jobs. And so bacteria that lived individually were not as successful as bacteria that were living in these specialized colonies. And so when they started working together, this is also the precursor to the first type of tissue that we have. Then we have about 1 billion years ago, we see our first multicellular organisms. Again, they weren't really much bigger than single-celled organisms. They, however, were what we know as tissues. So like a sponge would be a really primitive, modern-day eukaryotic organism. It's multicellular, but it doesn't have any organs. It's simply made of tissues. By the end of Precambrian time, though, we saw a mass extinction. As we do at the end of every time period, we have a mass extinction. This mass extinction happened about 54 million years ago. Since then, we've had 5 mass extinctions on Earth's history, and we're nearing our 6th. We know we're nearing our 6th when you start to see mass populations of species start to die off. And right now we're having that. And that's because we're starting to have an increase in temperature, and most species can't adjust their homeostasis or internal temperatures with the increasing external temperatures. So the end of this period was a combination of not just climate change but geological events such as volcanic eruptions. Tectonic plate movement would cause massive earthquakes and huge storms that were occurring on here. So then from Precambrian time, we go into the Paleozoic era. And the Paleozoic era is the era of what we call old life. And so it's kind of a neat little era because we have some really cool fossils that actually occurred from here. It lasted from 544 to 245 million years ago, and was divided into 6 major periods. And so our Precambrian time, the periods really had advancements in species during those time periods. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that. I have to break this video into a couple parts just because of the length of it.